Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome to the Torrey Botanical Society's Torrey Talks lecture series back in person. We had an in-person banquet last year, but this is our first regular talk back in person since the pandemic, so this is very exciting. There are folks on Zoom as well, which hopefully we'll hear from some questions at the end. So I'm Catherine Mercier. I am the programming chair. I work for the NYC Parks Department as a forester, and I'm finishing a PhD at CUNY. And I'd like to start by just telling you a little bit about the society. So the Torrey Botanical Society was founded in 1867 by colleagues and mentees of John Torrey. We're an organization for anyone interested in plant life, from professional and amateur botanists to anyone who enjoys nature and learning about plants. Oh, yes, thank you. I appreciate it. And I have notes, and I forgot to pull them up before I started talking. So I'm going to keep talking and pull them up at the same time. So the overall mission of the Torrey Botanical Society is to promote an interest in botany and to disseminate information in all phases of plant science. And to that end, we host things like public lectures. We also have field trips. I'm going to highlight a few upcoming field trips. We have the Journal of the Torrey Botanical Society, which has a special issue on New York State botany coming up soon. We're looking for applications for that. We also fund graduate and undergraduate student research and sponsor symposia and regional conferences. The best way to stay updated on everything Torrey Botanical Society is to become a member, which you can do at torreybotanical.org. You can also stay up to date with everything we're doing on social media. So almost everywhere we are at Torrey Botanical, except on YouTube, where we post recordings of these lectures, we're at Torrey Botanical Society. So for upcoming talks, maybe. Okay, upcoming field trips. So this Saturday, we're going to be in Van Cortlandt at 10 a.m. And then the next two Saturdays, I believe they're both Saturdays, are going to be out in Staten Island. And right now you can find more information on the field trips on the Eventbrite page for Torrey. And I also wanted to share the advertisement for the special issue coming up. So again, this is New York State Botany. If you want more information, email the editor-in-chief, Dr. Copenhagen. And before I introduce our speaker, if you're on Zoom, please do keep yourself muted, but you're welcome to have your camera on or off. We will have a question and answer portion at the end of the talk. For those in person, raise your hand. You can ask your question. And then if you're on Zoom, please put your question in the chat and we'll read it out. And if you would like to share this lecture with someone else or rewatch it later, it will be recorded and available on the YouTube page. So I'm very excited for this season of talks. It's all going to be New York City botany, and it's going to be led off by Dr. James Lendemer, who earned his PhD at the Graduate Center University of New York. And went on to a postdoc and a curator position at the New York Botanical Garden until last year, when he took the position as the curator of botany at the New York State Museum in Albany. James is a lichenologist with wide-ranging experience in biodiversity science, natural history collections, and botanical history. And with that, I will hand it over to James to talk about, I forgot to confirm his pronunciation. Abraham Halsey and the New York Lyceum, uncovering the origins of New York botany.
And so tonight I'm going to share with you a truly remarkable story that's been 2 centuries in the making. So I've spent the better part of the last year working on this project, and the details of it are still unfolding. It's taken me to archives and libraries across the region. It's provided countless opportunities to work with and learn from the amazing communities of experts who collectively stored our knowledge and our history. I've gone down endless rabbit holes exploring the growth and the evolution of New York City and the development of science, not just here in the city, but across New York State and well beyond. Science and society, past to present, and certainly also the future, they're all connected and woven together so that one string or one narrative can't be separated from the countless others. I hope that everyone leaves here tonight energized by the light that's been shed on some of the biggest mysteries surrounding the origins of the natural sciences in New York, and by the amazing new discoveries and connections, or maybe let's call them rediscoveries and reconnections, that are possible when we communicate across disciplines and organizations, and through digitizing the wealth of holdings that are preserved in the cultural institutions across the state. Now, just to give you a little bit of background, I'm originally from Philadelphia, and my experiences in art and science came from the transformative institutions that the visionary citizens of Philadelphia built and championed. The Free Library of Philadelphia, the Wagner Free Institute of Science, the Franklin Institute. You're welcome to come in. The Franklin Institute, the American Philosophical Society, University of Pennsylvania, and the Academy of Natural Sciences are just a few of those. And their importance really can't be understated, especially for the aspirations of every new generation. And that was certainly the case for myself. So here I am as a child, riding on the back of a replica of Hadrosaurus folkii, the first dinosaur described from North America and the state fossil of New Jersey. Maybe it isn't surprising that my passion came to be natural history collections and museums. Now, as a botanist who specializes in the biodiversity and conservation of lichens, I've spent much of the last 2 decades working with colleagues and collaborators to develop a systematic understanding of the diversity of these amazing organisms, how and why they're distributed across the ecosystems where they occur, and with working with students and educators to build the capacity that we urgently need to address gaps in our understanding and our knowledge, as well as in public perception, to assure that lichens remain intact and healthy for future generations. While this work has taken many forms and involved many disciplines, from genomics and taxonomy to fire ecology and biodiversity gradients, the constant theme is that it's all been driven by data from natural history collections. Now, I've spent much of my career to date building this baseline of knowledge about lichens across the eastern United States, but that work's been focused most strongly on critically imperiled and globally diverse ecosystems in the Appalachian Mountains and the Southeast. Expanding this work to cover the Northeast, especially New York, is something that I've always wanted to do. And that's why I was so excited to join the staff of the State Museum a year ago. So even though our current building may date to the 1970s, the collections are much, much older. The Botanical Collection, or the herbarium, is the oldest active one in New York. It was founded in 1836, just before the herbarium. Oh, thanks. Oh, no.
Oh, no.
I have no idea what just happened there. There, no.
No. Oh, no.
Close that.
No,
No.
No, don't leave meeting. What happens if you just choose one? Let's choose
Yeah, yeah.
that one.
Yes.
Oh.
that'll work. Oh,
Ooh, that's right. Yay.
yes.
Sorry.
okay, sorry, thank you.
The point is that even though our building dates to the 70s, and maybe this technology does as well, the collection is much older and it dates to 1836. And that's just before the herbarium at nearby Union College in Schenectady was founded in 1840. So when I started working at the State Museum, I immediately set out to learn about the history of the collection and about the history of botany in New York, the things you do when you take a job like that. And that's when I was surprised to discover that the first real herbarium in New York wasn't the one in Albany, but rather it was located here in New York City and was founded in 1817. The evolution of that collection, what happened to it, and the stories, the people and the places involved in its journey are the subject of today's talk. Now, I think at this point, it would be helpful to explain a little bit about my role as the state curator of botany, because the work I'm talking about tonight, welcome. The work that I'm talking about tonight is actually my job. The New York State Museum is a department of the University of the State of New York. And even if you aren't familiar with that name, you've almost certainly interacted with it. In the words of the State Education Department, it's the most complete interconnected system of educational services in the United States, and it includes CUNY and SUNY, among many other organizations. So there's a state science service that includes the scientists and the staff of the museum. Within the state, I think I have to click on the slide again. Is that true? No, there we go. For some reason that should have. Within the state science service, there's a biological survey, and their roles are defined in Education Law 235D. Rather than reading all of these words, I think it's sufficient to say that those of us in the Biological Survey are charged with advancing knowledge, interpreting, publishing, educating, and informing, preserving and growing collections, and cooperating and collaborating, at least as those areas relate to biodiversity and ecosystems in New York State. And while this work certainly involves field work and the collection of new specimens and new data, it just as frequently involves the study of existing natural history collections and archives. I thought we had some more folks. Of existing natural history collections and archives. It also involves helping stabilize or secure the existing collections. So for instance, here's the head of the research and collections helping to prepare a herbarium from Long Island for transfer to the State Museum in Albany. And it also involves building new collections. Like in the case of the new herbarium, we helped the Adirondack Mountain Club, established as a reference for their naturalist interpreters and their botanical monitors. Here's the herbarium cabinet on the back of a truck heading up to the Adirondacks from Albany. Now, studying natural history collections in addition to making new ones is existing ones in addition to making new ones is essential to understanding how life on Earth has changed, how it's changing, and how it's going to change in the future. In fact, using specimens in this way has become really the central theme of many areas of science. So for instance, in showing that fungi have, not sure why that is not. A second, there we go. For instance, showing that fungi have phenologies just like plants, showing that plant phenology has shifted over time in response to climate, that birds have shifted their migration routes, how much carbon soot was in the atmosphere in the past, and even in constructing global conservation strategies like for the world's oceans. Now today, the botanical organisms we're going to focus on are lichens, and lichens are symbiotic fungi that are absolutely remarkable. When we name a lichen, we refer to the fungus that's always present and gives the symbiosis much of its overall form. In this case, that's the yellow foliose lichen candleflame, Candelaria concolor. You all have seen it today on your walk here. When we talk about lichens, though, it's often in this collective sense of the communities of partners that are involved in the symbiosis. So a lichen is always composed of its primary fungus. I am not sure why these are not quite showing up that way. Let me just click on this one more time and see if that helps. There we go. All right. So it's the primary fungus as well as one or more core photosynthesizing algae or cyanobacteria that provide nutrients through photosynthesis. But it also includes all sorts of other microorganisms, other unrelated non-lichen fungi, invertebrates, and a wide array of chemicals produced by all of these living things. Now, this lifestyle is really unusual because it creates, yeah, there's something wrong with, can I restart this by any chance? There's something wrong with the way it's doing it. And I hate for you all to have a not pleasant experience.
Let me get rid of this. And then...
Okay, sorry, let's just see if it'll work now. This is what happens when you, there we go, okay. Hopefully this works. Yeah, we're cycling through, okay. I just want you all to have the maximal visual experience possible. So this lifestyle is really unusual because it creates a really strong dichotomy for lichens. On one hand, they have this internal food source and this sturdy body that's capable into going into dormancy for long periods of time when they're dry. And so that makes them able to survive and thrive in like all sorts of conditions. But on the other hand, relying on this delicate and diverse partnership makes them extremely sensitive to disturbance, pollution, and other rapid changes in the environment. Now, the story of New York City lichens is a well-known one. We know that historically there were well over 100 species, but that as the city grew and expanded, many species went into decline or were extirpated. And then with industrialization and really intense air pollution, almost all of the remaining species were wiped out. Then, as air quality improved and large-scale disturbance decreased, lichens began to recolonize the areas where they'd previously been lost. Now, New York City once had thriving and diverse living communities, and that included these disturbance and pollution intolerant species. And we know that because of natural history collections. So for instance, we know that the lungwort, Loberia pulmonaria, once grew in the Hamptons and across the river from the Bronx in New Jersey. There is, however, one missing piece to the well-established narrative that's always loomed large over our understanding of New York City lichens. The first baseline of lichen diversity was established in 1823. It was published as the first paper in the first issue of the Annals of the Lyceum of Natural History of New York, the precursor to the New York Academy of Sciences. That paper consisted of an annotated checklist and a so-called synoptical view, authored by Abraham Halsey. He was a founding member of the Lyceum and a member of the prominent Halsey family, for which Halsey Street is named, and also for which a stop on the M line is named. Now, this work, in Halsey's own words, consisted of a catalog of the lichens, which I've collected in the neighborhood of this city and within a circuit of 50 miles. A few are added, of which specimens were received from correspondents in the northern part of the state and in Massachusetts. Unfortunately, Halsey's entire collection was lost and believed to have been destroyed, such that it's never been possible to verify with exact certainty what modern species his historical reports would have corresponded to. Lots changed in 2 centuries. You need the specimens to look at to be able to tell exactly what he had. So if we were to visualize Abraham Halsey's study area today, it would be the extent of this circle, although it's likely that the bulk of his collecting would have been focused on Manhattan Island and adjacent areas that were relatively easy to access at that time. The Lyceum of Natural History of New York, I'm going to call it the Lyceum throughout the rest of this talk, was the second society founded in North America that was devoted specifically to the natural sciences. It was founded in 1817, just 5 years after the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia in 1812. Now, at the time, there were other organizations like the American Philosophical Society, also founded in Philadelphia, but in 1743, but they studied a wider array of subjects. The Lyceum occupied a space in City Hall Park in Lower Manhattan. Within the park, the group met in a room of what was once known as the Old Alms House, and which had become repurposed under the name of the New York Institution. It housed multiple organizations, including what eventually became the New York Historical Society. And it was where the organization stored their collections. When Halsey presented his paper to the Lyceum, it would have been in this building. Today, the site is occupied by the famous Tweed Courthouse. Now, throughout this talk, you're going to see maps. And every time there's a gray star, that's where the collection was. And the colored stars are where the collection is when I'm talking about the slide. Now, eventually, the government offices in City Hall needed additional space. And so they reclaimed the Old Alms House. And that forced the societies based there to relocate. So in 1831, the Lyceum moved from City Hall Park to space in the New York Dispensary, several blocks north on White and Center Streets. And there it remained until 1836. Incidentally, this is what stands there today. In 1836, the Lyceum secured enough funds to build their own building at Prince Street and Broadway. They had meeting rooms and they displayed their collections. When the building opened, a young botanist from Oneida County, New York, was hired to curate the collection and manage the building. He even had an apartment in the building, suggesting that even in 1836, it was hard for a botanist to afford to live in New York City. Does anyone know who that botanist was?
Asa Gray.
It was Asa Gray, father of American botany. Well before he moved to Harvard and sort of became established in the figure that we know him as today. Now you can imagine that it was during this time when the Lyceum's future seemed bright and to lie in being a premier natural history museum, that Halsey might have donated his collection of lichens for safekeeping and the study of others. Unfortunately, the Lyceum's building no longer stands today. Sharon, you might recognize that building.
Yes.
Now, from its earliest days, the core of botanical expertise in the Lyceum centered around John Torrey and Abraham Halsey. Both of them were young, they were energetic, and they had complementary interests in vascular plants and cryptogams, so things like fungi and lichens. They were not the only botanists that were associated with Lyceum in its early days. So for instance, David Hossick, the founder of the Elgin Botanic Garden, which was located on the site of what's now Rockefeller Center, was also involved. From its inception, the Lyceum began amassing natural history collections, including botanical specimens, in what was the first institutional herbarium in New York State. The New York Historical Society also maintained some natural history collections, and conveniently, they met in an adjacent room in the early days. And so early on, the two societies recognized their overlapping efforts, and the Historical Society gave its herbarium to the Lyceum. That's
No
how.
slides again.
He's commenting that your pictures aren't.
Oh, no, it should be that way. All shall be revealed. So that's how Hassek's important collection that had many of the original specimens from Carl Linnaeus, among others, came to the Lyceum. Now you're probably wondering why I'm talking over a blank slide. The reason for this is that we know remarkably little about the Lyceum's herbarium. We know it was hugely important because it contained the earliest specimens that documented the flora of New York City. It consisted of thousands of specimens, and it grew rapidly. It grew rapidly because specimens were received from various sources, because it was the only such institution in the state, one of the few in America, and was at the center of what was already a dynamic and cosmopolitan city with global connections. Sadly, in 1844, the Lyceum was forced to sell their building when they ran into financial troubles. The collections and library were moved to the Stuyvesant Institute on Broadway near Bond Street. Again, that building no longer stands today.
Yeah.
You notice a common theme here. In 1851, the Stuyvesant Institute was sold, and the Lyceum again was forced to relocate. The collections, comprising all of the earliest natural history objects from New York City, were packed up and placed in storage in the basement of the University Medical College at 14th Street and Irving Place, near Union Square. There they remained, where they were dutifully checked on periodically by the curators of the society. That location, by the way, is now the site of a large Con Edison building and several blocks from my apartment in Manhattan. It's almost like it was fated to be. Just before midnight on May 21st in 1866, tragedy struck. The Academy of Music on the northeast corner of 14th Street and Irving Place caught fire. It was rapidly consumed by flames. The fire spread to the University Medical College, where it destroyed nearly all the earliest natural history objects from New York City, which would have been in the possession of the eminent society at that time, the New York Lyceum. The fire continued to spread. It destroyed a piano factory and several townhomes. And that's the story that lichenologists have told for decades about the fate of New York's first lichen collections. Jessica Allen and I repeated this story in our book, Urban Lichens. And when preparing slides for a talk about New York lichens, I realized that I needed some pictures of old historical lichen collections from the city. The New York Botanical Garden Herbarium has lots and lots of lichens, including many from New York, but surprisingly few of them from the city itself, and even fewer that predate the Botanical Garden's founding in 1891. So instead, I went to the Brooklyn Botanic Garden Herbarium, which houses all of the oldest lichen specimens from New York City. Most of those were collected in Brooklyn and Queens in the 1860s, and were part of the collections of the Brooklyn Institute of Arts and Sciences. You can see an example of one of those on the right that was collected in Ridgewood, Queens in 1860. When the Brooklyn Botanic Garden Herbarium was formed in 1914, it amalgamated the collections of three institutions that were contemporaries of the Lyceum in Manhattan. The first of these was the Brooklyn Institute, formed in 1834 from the merger of the Brooklyn Lyceum and the Brooklyn Apprentices Library. That later became the Brooklyn Museum. The second was the Long Island Historical Society, founded in 1864, which is today the Center for Brooklyn History. And the third was the Brooklyn Lyceum, the precursor to the Brooklyn Institute, most of whose collections and archives were destroyed in a fire, the remnants of which were apparently transferred to the Long Island Historical Society in 1879. In other words, the oldest historical collections from Long Island and New York City are mostly in the Brooklyn Botanic Garden Herbarium, not just for lichens, but for vascular plants and other botanical organisms as well. When I went to go take my photographs, I noticed that there was a cabinet that was marked as containing lichens that I hadn't looked at before. And in the cabinet, I found a box, and in the box, I found a time-worn book. The book was Halsey's Lost Lichen Collection. It contains 265 specimens and nearly all of the vouchers for his 1823 checklist, together with additional specimens that he presumably collected after the checklist was published. Unfortunately, the specimens of two large, diverse genera, Lucidia and Lecanora, are missing, but still, it's remarkable that anything at all survived. And we know it's Halsey's book because it's his handwriting on every specimen, including the annotation of provenance on the first page that tells you that they all came from New York. Remember that at that time, New York was defined differently from how it's defined today. The famous Long Island botanist Smith Eli Jelliff, the first curator of the Brooklyn Institute herbarium, annotated the book as probably Halsey's lichens. And then Henry Newt Svensson, the first curator of the Brooklyn Botanic Garden herbarium, also annotated as the same. But if you'll notice, he mistook the many references to Louis David von Schweinitz in the collection as indicating that the specimens came from Schweinitz. You can see, by the way, chiefly from Schweinitz right there. I should have highlighted it. Schweinitz is widely known today as the father of American mycology, and he had an active correspondence with Halsey that's preserved in the archives of the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia. The SCHW, or the SCH that's written on the top of many of the specimens, indicates that they were compared to Schweinitz's specimens by Halsey. Think about this for a second. How did Halsey, who was based in New York City, compare his specimens to those of Schweinitz, who was based in Winston-Salem, North Carolina? Well, we know from their letters that Halsey borrowed Schweinitz's reference collection of lichens on loan via stagecoach in 1823 and then returned them a year later. Let's just let that sink in. Abraham Halsey managed to borrow and safely return the entire lichen collection of the foremost authority on American fungi on loan via stagecoach from Winston-Salem, North Carolina to Manhattan.
That's wild.
Also, this book of 1865, this book of 265 lichens is the largest and oldest collection of natural history specimens that survived from New York City. And it's the only known remaining piece of the Lyceum's once vast collection. Again, we can say with almost certainty that these collections, many of which have very little data, which is typical of specimens from that time, support Halsey's checklist. So for any given genus, like let's say Graphis, the script lichens, all the checklist names, the corresponding specimens. And the additional specimens represent largely post-1823 additions that were made by Halsey in preparation for comprehensive New York lichen flora that he never completed. All of these specimens are also readily identifiable today. Now, the collection also contains specimens that were sent by the botanist Dennis Cooley, presumably Halsey's Massachusetts correspondent. And some of these are still in the envelope that he gave Halsey. And they include a tangle of fruticose lichens, some of which, like Usnea angulata and Usnea longissima, have been completely extirpated from Massachusetts, let alone many other areas of New England and many areas of their range. Many are now threatened and endangered. The logical question to ask is how the collection survived. Well, key to this is probably that Halsey's collection was preserved in a book. You'll see our stars have now moved to green. When the Lyceum packed its collections for storage, the books were separated from the specimens. While the specimens were sent to 14th Street, where they were destroyed in 1866, the books were sent to the Mercantile Library Association at Astor Place, where they escaped the fire. From there, the books moved again in 1867 to Mott Memorial Hall near Madison Square Park, where they would have stayed for over a decade. Again, that building no longer stands today, but Laura Briscoe, my colleague who's here today, suggested we should contact this psychic to see if they can get in touch with Abraham Halsey to tell us what the location of the rest of the Lyceum's collection is. When the American Museum of Natural History opened its building in 1878, the Lyceum Library moved there. The scene of Central Park, the Upper West Side, and at this point, the one wing of the American Museum of Natural History looks really different from it does today. In 1886, it moved again, this time back downtown to the Columbia College Library. And there it stayed for another decade until it was moved again uptown to Skirmerhorn Hall on Columbia University's campus in Morningside Heights. And it was at this time that Nathaniel Lord Britton motioned that a committee be formed to determine the deposition of the Lyceum's library. Britton went on to be one of the founders of the New York Botanical Garden in the Bronx just a few years later in 1891. With Britton involved, the committee decided that the library should be split, and they decided that the non-botanical books should be deposited back in the American Museum of Natural History. And they decided that the botanical books, of course, should be deposited at the newly established New York Botanical Garden in the Bronx. But if the botanical books went to the Bronx, then how did Halsey's collection end up at the Brooklyn Botanic Garden? Shirley Britton, who's well known for his zealous collections acquisition, would have obtained the collection if he'd seen it in storage at Columbia University, or subsequently found it among any of the botanical books. There's no record of the collection in the New York Academy of Sciences archives, which holds the original Lyceum records. It must have left the Lyceum collection after the fire in 1866, when someone who would have found a book of specimens would have thought to deposit them in an institution with other botanical specimens, especially cryptogams. The logical organizations would at that time have been in Brooklyn, and would have been one of the three that formed the early herbarium of the Brooklyn Botanic Garden. But I can assure you that after considerable work, there is no record of Halsey's lichens or any such collection in any of those Brooklyn institutions, not in the meticulous records of the Brooklyn Institute of Arts and Sciences, not in the scrapbooks of the Long Island Historical Society that record the transfer of a crate of remnants of the Brooklyn Lyceum, not in the Brooklyn Botanic Garden accession records, and not in the copious publications and reports that were produced by all of these institutions. How the collection survives remains a complete and utter mystery. Now, while the route to the survival of Halsey's collection is a mystery, it raises the question of what happened to the rest of the Lyceum's herbarium. All the contemporary media accounts of the 1866 fire sensationalized the scene as complete and total destruction. But if one book of specimens survived, why didn't all the other botanical collections that were also kept in books survive? And I'm not the first person to wonder this. Christine Chapman Robbins published a long paper in 1960 questioning the same narrative of destruction. And of course, as with many things, the story is actually more nuanced than has been previously portrayed. In fact, it seems that the Lyceum, after it lost its building, began searching for another home for its collections. So there's a letter from the Lyceum to the Free Academy from approximately 1854, it's undated, suggesting that they had reached an agreement. And the Free Academy was the predecessor to City College and was located at that time near the present campus of Baruch College at 23rd Street and Lexington Avenue. There's also a letter in 1859 where the Lyceum approached Peter Cooper about a similar agreement with the Cooper Institute. The Cooper Institute was the predecessor to the Cooper Union and located at Astor Place in Manhattan. The Cooper Institute held its own types of collections, and these were eventually transferred to the Cooper Hewitt Museum of Design on the Upper East Side. Now, much of what I found out about the Lyceum's history has been made possible by access to the New York Academy of Sciences archives. And the amazing thing is that the entire archive has been scanned and made available online. So it was possible to repeatedly search and read documents as I learned new pieces of information. Archives are often organized in such a way that if you don't know that an individual document exists in advance, it can be difficult or impossible to discover and locate it. Some of the most important documents that I found were filed with general correspondence and institutional records because they didn't pertain specifically to the collections or to the library. So for instance, there's a single slip of paper with notes about meetings regarding the creation of Central Park. It notes that as of 1862, the commissioners of Central Park authorized funding and space for the Lyceum to construct a building to house its collections. And then it notes that in 1871, there were plans to place 4 different institutions on the same site in Manhattan Square. I went to the 1862 commissioner's report and found the record where they noted that the Lyceum requested a permanent home, and then they proceeded to extol the importance of the collections and their need for preservation. Incidentally, the yearly reports for the commissioners of Central Park are all available online through New York City's website. And if you haven't ever read them, I encourage you to. They are a fascinating read. The most important document that I found in the New York Academy of Sciences archives was without a doubt an inventory of the Lyceum's property from 1864, 2 years before the fire. It gives the specific location of every part of the collections they held, even individual objects like paintings and sculptures. And now it might be hard to see, but if you notice at the bottom of the page, on the first page, it confirms that rather than being held in storage on 14th Street, the library was held separately at the Mercantile Library Association. But importantly, it also says that the herbaria are in the same place. So New York's first herbarium was not in fact destroyed in 1866. There's also a note appended to the second page of the inventory that states that a number of boxes of minerals and fossils were also saved from the fire, and they were left with one Mr. Sanderson at number 2411. So what's the first thing you do when you read those words? You contact the Mercantile Library Association. At one time, the association, which was primarily based in a massive building at Astor Place, was a vast library with tens of thousands of books. The number of books that they bought on a yearly basis is astonishing. Their budget must have been unbelievable. Over time, the library eventually was mostly disbanded and deposited at other institutions. But the archives remain with the current incarnation of the Mercantile Library Association, which is the Center for Fiction in Brooklyn. So the archivist there said that there's no record of the Lyceum's collections and that they weren't held, and that there's no record of, and that they're not actually held anymore by the Center for Fiction. But she invited Jeremy Holland, a graduate student from CUNY, who's here tonight, and I to examine the archives for clues. She said, you know, if you want, come and take a look. While the meeting minutes for the board, While the meeting minutes for the board of directors are preserved for the most part of the 19th century, those around 1866 are missing. The published annual reports aren't fully digitized, but Jeremy found the report from 1855 and found the piece of the report where the Lyceum was granted permission to store its library and presumably its herbarium at the Mercantile Library. There's no record in the annual reports of that the collection ever left the library or what happened to it after that point. After that, the trail goes cold. We know the herbarium wasn't destroyed in 1866 and that it was stored in Clinton Hall at Astor Place in Manhattan. That explains why there wasn't a bigger commotion in the scientific community about the loss of the collections. And it's why the fire was never mentioned in any of the correspondence of Torrey, of Gray, or of any of the other contemporary botanists that I've examined. But there's also no records of the collection in any of the many archives and institutions that I've consulted. And while most of the meeting minutes of the Lyceum survive, the exception is the 10-year period surrounding the fire in 1866. Now, even if the meeting book had been destroyed in the fire in 1866, you would have thought that they would have bought a new book prior to 10 years later. They were having meetings during that time. In fact, though, there is one last tantalizing clue. And that comes to the New York Academy of Sciences meeting minutes from 1882. It comes in what was evidently amongst a series of, let's just say, robust discussions surrounding association with Columbia University. So during this time, botanical activity and involvement had really waned. Torrey and Halsey were dead. Gray had moved. Britain was not yet active, and the New York Botanical Garden hadn't been founded. In the midst of the meeting on February 1st in 1882, someone piped up and they asked what happened to the herbarium and the boxes that had been saved from the fire in 1866. The curators of the society were immediately charged urgently to produce a report on the matter. No report was ever entered into the subsequent minutes, and the subject never rose again. Somewhere in our area, the herbarium must be sitting unrecognized today. Now let's shift back to this amazing treasure that we have before us. Halsey's collection isn't complete, and we don't know the present day whereabouts of the Lyceum's herbarium. But that doesn't change the fact that these specimens have survived and they're identifiable. So here we have, for instance, a page of pyrennolichen specimens with my corresponding annotations, identifications. Here's another page from Parmeliaceae specimens with my identifications. And the specimens illustrate just how much the lichen communities in 1820s New York resembled those of remnant, mature and old growth and second growth forests today in areas like the Central Appalachian Mountains and Delmarva Peninsula. So for instance, on this page that includes the iconic cyanolichen Loberia pulmonaria, which we know used to grow in the Hamptons and also in New Jersey across from the Bronx. Well, it also grew in Manhattan. And the specimen also hosts parasitic fungus Plectocarpon lichenum, that's the dark dots on it, that's an obligate parasite on this species. This specimen was collected in the autumn of 1820, likely on the bark of a walnut, in an area of the Upper West Side that was known as Bloomingdale Woods. From Halsey's surviving collections, we can say with certainty that there were 129 lichen species in New York City, and 97 of those correspond to reports from his published checklist. 32 more of them are species that were among the collections that he made after 1823. So even though 129 is lower than the actual number of species that must have been present, remember the collection's missing 2 of the largest genera, it's still remarkably close to the 94 species that were reported from New York City by Jessica Allen in 2020. So of those, though, only 16 species are shared. And when you look at that number, you probably think to yourself, wow, those are the few that survived, right? That would be wrong. Because in fact, we have to remember that lichens were completely eliminated from the city in the 1960s. So whatever's here now came back through recolonization. So in comparison to the, for lack of a better word, original flora of 1823, the lichen communities of New York City today have markedly fewer foliose and fruticose species, fewer sexually reproducing species that require a compatible algae in the environment to establish, and far fewer species that associate with ecologically sensitive partners like Trenipolia and cyanobacteria. All of these changes reflect communities that have newly established in an urban environment, which are adapted to varying degrees of pollution and disturbance. Now, prior to this project, I had never given much thought to Abraham Halsey. He only published one paper, and it's only ever referenced in the context of his lost collection. But in reviewing these specimens, it became clear just how carefully he studied this material. So for instance, this specimen was collected on April 26th in 1820 on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. And it shows that he revised his identifications and that he compared the material to reference specimens in Schweinitz's herbarium. Again, let's not forget that he got by a stagecoach. Importantly, all of his determinations are reasonable and they match the concepts that would have been in place at the time. So he was doing the best that he possibly could have done, and probably as good as we would do today. He wasn't doing half bad. Now, Halsey didn't just report species that were named by others. In fact, he described new species in his paper, and included among them was Citraria viridis. So later botanists were able to recognize this species based on its description because the description he wrote was so accurate, even in the absence of any surviving specimens. And so that species continues to be recognized today. The newly discovered specimen is the only surviving original material of the name, and so it has to replace the later specimen that someone else designated to serve as the specimen that is the basis of that name. Now, Citraria viridis is now recognized as Vulpicida viridis today. It's an Eastern North American endemic restricted to mature Atlantic white cedar swamps and to old-growth forests, old-growth oak forests. It's, of course, threatened across its range, but the name for the species doesn't recognize Halsey as the describer. And that's because 7 of the 8 species that were described in his paper use names that he received in correspondence from others. Somebody wants to go tell them to be quiet. That Halsey was subsequently overlooked and forgotten is illustrated by the fact that no one read the introduction to his paper, where he explicitly stated that he alone recognized the species as new and wrote the descriptions himself. The names were sent in correspondence from others, presumably as proof that he was in fact correct and that they were undescribed. He even reiterated this in a letter to Schweinitz when he sent him a copy of his paper in 1823. Halsey recognized the species and he described them, and all of the names have to be attributed to him under the rules for botanical nomenclature. Now, once I realized that the newly discovered collection may finally allow us to figure out what the remaining species that he described were, again, you needed to see the specimens to really be certain. I set about studying those names. And that led me to realize that he'd published a plate illustrating 4 of his new species. Again, I'd never seen this plate referenced before, and I was unaware of it. Why? Because it was published on page 410 of the same volume, completely dissociated from the text of the paper. Anyone familiar with Eastern North American lichens can tell you that these lichens are immediately recognizable and that Halsey must have had tremendous experience and familiarity with the species that he studied. He was able to communicate a lot through pictures in 1823. All of the species are easily recognized from their illustrations. One of them is Conotrema urceolatum. Another one is Viridothelium virens. It's actually an older name for that species. I think you can even see, these look like the pictures. One of them is Coniarthonia, and these species can't be identified without their spores, and the specimen that supports it was lacking spores, so we can't be certain of what it is, but it's probably the common species Coniarthonia pyrula. And then the final one looks like Ramboldia russula, but the specimen, a duplicate of it actually survives in Schweinitz's herbarium in Philadelphia, is actually Caloplaca flavoviridescens. The identification of that specimen matches the description that Halsey made of the lichen, but not the colors of the illustration. Each copy of the plate was probably not painted by Halsey himself, but instead was delegated to somebody else who didn't quite understand why the colors of lichens were so important. So it seems obvious at this point that Halsey was an authority on lichens, that he knew the species intimately, and that he published on the flora of his area with a remarkable degree of accuracy. It's clear that Halsey considered himself an expert on lichens, right? We know that because it's evidenced by his letters to John Torrey and some similar correspondence to Schweinus, where he talks about being among the trio of the most eminent American specialists on cryptogams. Those are statements of forthrightness that are not typical of the time, not typical of the culture of the 1820s. Now, given everything I've just told you, it's absolutely remarkable to think that somehow Abraham Halsey was effectively forgotten and reduced to a footnote in the relatively erudite and insular field of lichenology. But we also know remarkably little about him. There's no photograph, no painting, not even a silhouette of his likeness. The few brief biographical sketches reference that he was a banker. And this makes sense given that his name is associated with multiple banks in the city. You can see that from these newspaper clippings. Thank you, Dennis. But if you'll note, they're often well after he published his landmark paper. Given his position as a banker, it'd be logical to assume that he must have been like many other naturalists at the time and have been a man with status, resources, and leisure time to devote to scientific research, right? We would all probably assume that. But if you search the New York City Municipal Archives, there's a record of a court case for Abraham Halsey. In fact, in 1821, he became an insolvent debtor under a law that was passed in 1818 by the New York legislature. The documents that are preserved with the case provide a fascinating glimpse of someone who came from an established family. His father was a silversmith in Lower Manhattan who eventually took a government job at the Customs House. His brother was deeply involved in the earliest New York banks, and it was his brother who was there in the office of Richard Riker in City Hall with him and his first wife, Ann Gosman, when he declared his household insolvent. He and his wife provided an accounting of their debts that suggests that they owed in the modern equivalent of $175,000, while they were owed the modern equivalent of $13,000. So that $161,000 in debt came from many sources, and it included the routine expenses of daily living in an expensive city: food, rent, clothing, something that all of us can identify with. They provided an itemized list of their household property. While the itemization mentions every spoon, every frock, and every book, every teacup, it doesn't mention any botanical collections. This may be the clearest, if not most tragic way that we can believe Halsey had been depositing his specimens in the Lyceum and that this book is part of the original herbarium. Let that sink in for a second. So let's just put this in perspective. The Lyceum met in a room at the old almshouse in City Hall Park in Lower Manhattan. Abraham Halsey was among its founders. He attended regular meetings for many of his early years. And every week, he actually borrowed a book from its library that's in the weekly meeting minutes. So at the same time he was going through insolvency and his household gave up their property to satisfy his debts, he was also attending Lyceum meetings and even recording the meeting minutes with as the secretary. So those are his meeting minutes. He was collecting plants from the same time as the insolvency.
Wow.
He was collecting plants and lichens with Lyceum members, and he was preparing the first work devoted to lichens in North America, and one of the earliest American botanical works written by an American. And this was happening a few hundred yards away from the insolvency office in City Hall and from the building where debtors were imprisoned. Abraham Halsey was a founding member of the New York Academy of Sciences. He was an editor of its first journal and an illustrator for many of its early papers. He was a collaborator of John Torrey, and he was certainly acquainted with Asa Gray, among other iconic figures of New York botany, American botany, and let's just say plain old botany, probably science in general. He authored the first paper in the first volume of the Lyceum's journal, and it's the first published work devoted to North American lichens, which is also among the first American botanical works published by an American. He was an early citizen of two iconic cities, Manhattan, New York, and Brooklyn. He knew the father of American mycology and was seen as enough of an equal to have been trusted to receive his herbarium on loan. He corresponded widely in America, Europe, and even Cuba, although most of his correspondence doesn't survive. He was a careful observer who knew his lichens, and he recognized new ones that he also described. How has this pioneer of American lichenology and this seminal figure of New York botany come to be forgotten and his legacy reduced to a footnote? We don't even know what he looked like. Is it because he studied cryptogams rather than plants? Is it because in the absence of other people interested in the organisms that so clearly enthralled him, he eventually moved on to other pursuits? Is it because his collection was lost? Or is it because rather than spend a lifetime scurrying down enjoyable rabbit holes of lichen minutia, he was forced to spend long days and weekends working in various jobs to support his family until he was finally seen as financially responsible enough to work in the same business as his brother? If one thing's clear, we can now see how important he was to the development of lichenology and to botany in New York. We can also see that Abraham Halsey and the Lyceum's herbarium are just two threads in a rich and colorful tapestry that is woven of countless more stories like this that need to be told. And I think it's appropriate to end this talk by highlighting the work that this work is really facilitated by digitization and online access to resources. But New York State is a major gap in the digitization of botanical specimens. There's more than 10 million herbarium specimens in New York, and 77% of these are in just one institution, while the rest are distributed across more than 30 institutions throughout the state. Just looking at the raw numbers, you get the impression that the herbaria in the state are really well digitized, but that's because of the amazing work that's been done at the New York Botanical Garden. The overwhelming majority of the rest of the state remains to be digitized. Imagine the discoveries that could be possible when all of it's done, when we could actually search for and find all of these specimens in all of these institutions across the state. But then also think about, what the rest of the world sees. So, especially online. There are about 579,000 records of botanical organisms from New York State that are available online in databases. That doesn't include the growing number of records from iNaturalist. But when you look at that, more than half of those records are from herbaria outside of the state, and half of the records from inside the state are from one institution. So when someone uses online resources to try and understand New York botanical diversity, especially how it's changed over time, they're getting only a piece of the whole picture and a piece that's lacking many of the most important records because the smaller herbaria across the state are made up of unique cohorts of often highly specialized local collections that aren't duplicated elsewhere. Again, imagine how transformative it would be for the entire botanical community if we filled in the gap in digitization that exists between New England, the Mid-Atlantic, and the Great Lakes. And so with that, thank you all for attending. Thanks to the many organizations and folks that have helped me. I'm sure they are not all listed here. It's been a true delight. Maybe we have a few minutes for questions.
Yes, we certainly have a few minutes for questions. I'm gonna turn the lights back up.
I can do that.
There
Full
you go.
on or high?
Let's see full on.
Get out your sunscreen.
Yeah. Yeah, that's better. In person, any questions? I'll see what's going on Zoom.
I covered it all.
Are you gonna write a book about this?
So, that's a great question.
Because
Thank
it
you.
seems like a really great tale.
So that's a great question. And I forgot to mention, so this work is already submitted and going to be published as the next Torrey Botanical Society memoirs. So it'll be out, I think in October or November, I think is the online date. And so, yeah, it's a book length treatment of this, but it seems like with way more detail than I went into here, and a whole accounting of the collections and all of that. But I think there's a lot of fodder here and a million more threads that you could go through that would be fodder for a great book. I'm writing some other books too, so there's a lot on my plate at the moment. But I will say, just through doing this work, we found so many other amazing things that need to be worked on. Laura Briscoe and I went into the New York Botanical Garden Library and found several volumes of plants that were collected by Asa Gray when he was at the very beginning of his career. And nobody knew those were there because they're not in the herbarium, they're in the library.
So my question is going in the opposite direction from expanding into a book. Have you thought about condensing into New Yorker?
Sure.
Oh, yeah, that's a good question.
That would be really cool.
Times Magazine, yeah.
Yeah, sounds fun. More writing.
Editing.
Oh, I will.
Yeah, thank you, James. That was really fascinating. I particularly enjoyed the way you displayed the maps and the movement of the collection across Manhattan. And you laid it out so nicely, but I can imagine that that information was so difficult to find. And you alluded to a few things throughout, but can you talk a little bit more about how you found that information and tracked the movement of the collection?
Well, I will
Was that
say-
mostly through
Sure.
correspondence
Sure.
or archive? Yeah.
It's
Any of
actually
that.
really fortuitous that the Lyceum and New York Academy of Sciences, they're a really well-established, well-known, like big scientific organization. And so their history has actually been pretty well chronicled, right? Like the Lyceum is the early stages of this, and the New York Academy of Sciences kind of transformed into what it is today when they presumably shifted their focus after losing these collections, right? When they first started, it was like, we're going to be this premier natural history museum. But then when the collections were lost, something else happened. They changed focus. And so it's fortuitous because there are these great treatments of sort of their history that lay out what happened, at each date and time with these buildings. And also the paper that had been published by Christine Robbins was specifically looking about whether or not David Hossick's herbarium survived. And so she had already
Specifically the
did a lot.
Linnaean collection, specifically because
Specifically.
he had the only collection of Linnaean
Yes.
specimens in North America.
Yeah. So like if they had survived, it would have been a big deal. But again, this was in the 60s and maybe even 50s, when she would have been doing research. And at that time, you would have had to visit these archives in person. And again, you can just imagine if you're presented with piles of books and piles of papers in many folders, even if they're well organized, and you can read rapidly and you can read old handwriting rapidly, you have to know what you have to be able to sort of perambulate your way through things and just happenstance and be able to find them. And so that's why, having this all digitized was so helpful, because if I had just been able to go, to the archives of the New York Academy of Sciences one day and arrange to look at something, I probably would never have been able to find most of this. Also, a lot of it was OCR character scan. So even though that doesn't work well for handwritten text, especially handwritten text from the 1800s, it actually works well enough that you could try to find key terms that would get you into a page range of a 500-page, scan of handwriting, and then read around in there to try and find those bits and pieces. But really, at some point, I was like, there's no records. What? There's no records. When I found out that the 1866 meeting minutes were all missing, that was where I was like, well, there must be something. So I just figured there can't be that many documents that exist prior to 1900. So I looked at every document in the archives prior to 1900.
Wow.
And that's how I found like a slip of paper about Central Park. That stuff's just in correspondence with with normal, typical correspondence that you would have had with members of the Lyceum who were like sending in manuscripts and writing to be members and all of that. That's in the midst of 100 pages of different letters from people all over the world. There was one page that was an agreement with the Free Academy. So really fortunate that it builds on a lot of work that had been done by other people. And then also the fact that so much of this was online. That's the great thing. The amazing thing to me is that, I feel like if you go to a museum and if you work with collections, or if you ever, have been to a museum and seen collections, we see these like static objects that are in front of us. And sometimes you can have a specimen that was collected 100 years ago or 200 years ago. And it's like impossible to really understand and appreciate the fact that the thing in front of you has probably had this whole history of travel, and it's had a whole life that we never know until you do this kind of work. And then it's just amazing that anything survived, right? Like, I mean, how many things have you lost when moving apartments, right? Like moving that many times, it's amazing that anything survived. It's actually funny. So at the State Museum in Albany, we have the collections of James Yates, who was an Albany naturalist. And he went on the first expedition outside of the United States after the United States was established, as a country separate from England. And it traveled to South America and then to Antarctica, went all around down there. And so he collected all these plants down in the other Staten Island and in Patagonia. And they're up in Albany. And I said, why are these here? I wonder why these are here. And then in reading the meeting minutes, from 1821, I saw that in fact, he had deposited his specimens in the Lyceum's herbarium, and then he asked to remove them when he moved back to Albany. And Torrey and Halsey voted in favor. And the society formally allowed him to take his collections from the herbarium here back to Albany. And so that's why those specimens survived. Wow. And and also some of them were sent to England as well. And it's just amazing, you have this thing and it's like, who would have guessed that it, was here and then it narrowly avoided destruction potentially if it was destroyed. We don't know what happened to the collection, but it potentially avoided being lost. And now it's in Albany in my office.
I think this is a good transition to a question on Zoom from Carolyn. In early 2024, Duke University announced it was closing its herbarium. From what you learned from your project, what would you recommend for the preservation of Duke University collection?
They probably shouldn't get rid of their collection. It seems like a short-sighted decision to me. I mean, collections are so important and they're used by so many different communities and they have value beyond just, objects that are used in biological science. And I think to me, that's this kind of work that connects the specimens to the science, but also to the history and the social, setting of the time and people's lives. It's about connecting the humanities and science and all of these disparate things that's where the true value of it becomes, understood. Like we can appreciate why we probably shouldn't get rid of a Vermeer, but the same level of thought doesn't necessarily go into why we should maybe, deaccession a specimen that was collected 100 years ago. You hope it does, but maybe not always. And maybe we should think more about that and value these things more. Or you got a question?
Oh, I was just gonna ask, given the ways that it's obvious that these types of collections, and I think botanical collections more so than other natural history objects because of their sort of two-dimensionality and like they're basically like paper objects. And you can see that they were stored with the library and the Mercantile Association. And knowing what happened at Columbia and then the split and like the Natural History Museum, is there any, I know you say thank you to the American Museum of Natural History, but you didn't really talk too much about those archives. Is there more work to be done?
There's more work to be done
in those archives?
I've written to everybody. I've visited a number of these in person, but the whole thing with this is that nobody knows it's there, right? So it's sitting somewhere. If it's, so when I thought that the collection was just a few books, I was like, oh yeah, it could have been lost, right? But then when you think about the fact that like this was thousands of specimens, it's got to have been like 2 bookshelves worth of
One cabinet.
Yeah, like it was enough stuff that like it probably didn't just get thrown away. That would be illogical considering that someone would have known that these things were so important. But at the same time, now, after they were severed, after the connection to sort of the Lyceum and to botanical science would have been severed, and after the period in New York when there was really no botanical activity, especially in Manhattan, in what was then New York City, you can imagine that if these things are in a library or in an archive somewhere, they've become completely dissociated from their context. And they're not going to say Linnaeus's important specimens on them. They're going to have almost no information. And so someone potentially would look at them and say, oh yeah, there's these really old plants. Like these are historical, that's great, we should keep these. But they wouldn't necessarily recognize that, the volume got Linnaeus's handwriting on it or something like that. That's why like Henry Stenson thought that all of the lichens were from North Carolina. And you have to know the context, know the publications, be able to read the handwriting to really understand, oh, actually, that's not the case. It's a way more interesting story there. Yeah, Molly?
I see some names over on the right-hand side of the slide who used to be employed at Brooklyn Botanic Garden. Is there anyone now at Brooklyn Botanic Garden to talk to tell about this?
I've been in touch with them.
They know about this?
Yep. I've been in touch with them. Yeah. And I mean, one of them is on there somewhere. I also know that Gary Moore and Carrie Behringer, used to work there, and they had a lot of detailed knowledge about the herbarium itself. And so I figured, someone must remember this book being there, right? Like, I mean, it's just like, it's kind of wild to think that there's like a book that exists in a box that like someone could have seen, and yet there is literally no record of it anywhere, and no one remembers ever seeing it. And that includes lichenologists who went to the herbarium to use the herbarium in Brooklyn, but because the books were kept separate, as they often are in natural history collections in herbaria, they were there to study New York City lichens, and Svensson had annotated it as being mostly not from there, and didn't really have locality data on the specimens. So when they were there studying New York City lichens, Ernie Brode was there in the 60s. He was working on lichens of Long Island. He said he never saw it, and he never would have thought, oh, let me go look at this book of the room that had historical specimen books in it. That just wasn't the thing that would have been on your radar to necessarily have done. Again, it's like an archive. If you don't know it's there already, how will you find it?
Yeah, unfortunately, almost all of John Torrey's early collections are gone.
Well, because they were in the Lyceum.
Right. So in his catalog from 1817, doesn't include, he says that it's not a complete flora of the 50 miles of New York City. Got a lot of plants in there, but it's not a total inventory of what was in New York City. One plant that has speculated that was here, but although there's no specimen of it, is the bunchberry, Cornus canadensis. There's no proof that that was here in New York City. Of course, now it's long gone. It's not even close to New York City anymore. But since there was pulmonaria, obviously in the Upper West Side, and those two kind of grow in the same kind of habitat.
So you're asking, is there evidence from the lichens that I found in the book that a northern species, like a boreal Arctic species, would occur here?
Yes.
The answer is yes. So it's actually really fascinating what's in this book. And again, if you didn't have the whole context, you might assume that something was mislabeled or it came, it didn't come from here. But so Peltigera venosa, which is an Arctic or boreal species that grows on soil, it's super distinctive. Halsey had a specimen of it. And I thought, and he remarked everything that was foreign. So anything he received from one of his correspondents, he wrote that it was foreign. And it's consistent. So that's what, I feel like, there's one or two things that are probably potential errors, but everything says that so consistently that I think he was doing it really carefully. And at first when I saw that, I was like, oh, really? I don't know. That doesn't seem right. But then I went to the checklist and it's in the checklist. So, that was here. And at the same time, there's, the supposition that these things were from North Carolina. Well, there's no species in the book that are common southeastern coastal plain species that don't occur here, except for several species that are at the edge of their range in New Jersey or on Delmarva, where this was probably the northern limit of their distribution back then. And it's just that they were, the habitats that they occurred in were completely altered and the lichens were extirpated by pollution and by disturbance. So, New York, the coastal plain in general is a meeting place of different biotas, and New York City covers a lot of area that includes northern and southern things. Yeah. And, you get all these different things that meet in this one small area. So yeah, I think from the lichens, there's actually, it's reasonable that species could have occurred here. Just based on the lichens. I was surprised by that picture. So yeah.
How does Halsey's checklist compare to the Cofinch Austin's book that he collected half a century later across the river? Do you know? Have you looked at those species?
I haven't looked at, actually haven't revised all the specimens in that book. I think they're pretty similar. So the cohorts is something that really needs to be done, is to look at the lichens that are in the Palisades from Cofinch Austin from a little bit later.
Yeah.
But my impression is that they're pretty similar, but there's, again, in the Palisades, you have southern species and northern species at the edge of their ranges. And that's well known for vascular plants, and it's the case for lichens as well. So it's a similar pattern, and I think the cohorts of species are pretty similar, but you get some stuff there that didn't occur here. Again, Halsey's collection isn't complete, right? And the two of the biggest and most interesting in some way genera specimens are missing. So if we had those, I think we'd have a lot more species, because some of those were groups that had 20 or 30 species in his sense. And in his book, there could be, sometimes one specimen has 3 different species on the piece of bark. So there's plenty of things where there were admixtures that were not reported on the checklist, but they're documented in his book, or in his collection, which happens to be his book.
Didn't the Halsey family have, involved in, iron foundry?
So
Didn't
Halsey,
they have a giant iron foundry somewhere in Brooklyn, I think?
it was in Manhattan at Corlear's Hook. So he took over, I think it was the one that I think he took over the one at Corlear's Hook. Yeah, he writes about that in his correspondence to Schweinitz. And so that was actually one of the interesting things with the insolvency paperwork from 1821, is that when you realize that there was a major event in his life that, fundamentally changed his ability to devote time to things, all of a sudden it makes sense why every other letter to Schweinitz is like suddenly spaced by a year or spaced by 2 years. And he's like profusely apologizing for not writing and not having had the time to work on projects and not being able to do this, that, and the other because he's consumed by work. He specifically mentions taking over the iron foundry. Yeah, so he was
Isn't it ironic that he was involved in the business, which like extirpated all the lichens?
Yeah, yeah.
All right, so for our last question, I like to ask all the speakers, like, if there's one takeaway message, one thing that you want the audience here and on Zoom to like go home thinking about from your talk.
It's the wealth of untold stories or, overlooked stories that exist in all of these cultural institutions across New York State, and how important it is that we preserve and, educate people about these things, because they aren't just static, dead objects that no one cares about. They're relevant to us today and certainly relevant to our futures. We can learn from them, we hope. If we can learn anything, we can learn anything.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So keep an eye out for our talks in October and November. We'll be doing more NYC botany. In October, we're going to have a virtual talk from Brad Oberly about some work at the Thane Family Forest at NYBG. And then in November, we'll be back here, I think in one of the other classrooms, to hear from Lydia Paradiso, who's going to be talking about some checklist comparisons of plants through the past 2 centuries in New York City. So yeah, thank you all for being here.